So we're now being recorded. Bruchim habayim. Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Great to see you. I'll just let you know that this is actually going to be the final morning class we have during the summer. We'll be continuing after the holidays at some point, right after Shemini Atzeret, Simchat Torah. There will be one more class, but it'll be an evening class only, and that'll be on August the 20th, 2 weeks from today, simply because there's a bar mitzvah celebration that morning, so I won't be able to do the morning class as well. But in any case, I'll take the opportunity now just to thank you all, many of you who've joined and been part of our study sessions since way back in March, and it's been a pleasure working with you and studying together with you. And hopefully we've taken a look at some things from different perspectives and some perhaps unconsidered matters and issues that will give you pause for thought and deeper inspection and exploration of our texts. So before I start with today, I just wanted to acknowledge the fact that two of you, and you happen to be here today, took my assignment from a couple of weeks ago very seriously. And I don't want to embarrass you, but I'd like to ask if either Ruth or Barbara, I didn't mean to mention your name, sorry. If either Ruth or Barbara would be willing just to share in a moment your impressions. You don't have to go back over everything that you shared with me, which I really appreciate, substantial insight that you offered from your exploration of both the Canadian and Israeli national anthems. But if maybe just for a minute or so, if there's a highlight or one element of either or both of those that you'd like to share with the others that you found interesting. Again, don't go over everything, just pick one thing that was particular interest to either of you. Barbara, would you like to go first since you're off mute already?
I was amazed at all of my knowledge of French in the background and being a teacher. I really had no idea about the background of our national anthem and that it was basically in French initially. And the words were quite religious, and it was really very interesting to get that background and know that it was connected somehow to Queen Victoria. Her daughter was here visiting. So I kept forgetting why we kept singing God Save the Queen way back then. And Hatikva, I found fascinating that Theodore Herzl was totally opposed to the words. He did not like it at all.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. Ruth, would you like to share something, just one of the impressions you had of either or both of the anthems?
Yeah, also like Barbara, I felt that the French version of the Canada national anthem, I felt it was very racist, actually, because some of the terms they used were I won't say it in French, I can't remember, but we're proud of our great exploits, the land that we conquered. We bear the cross. I just felt it was a little bit racist by today's standards. So I was quite surprised. I didn't expect that. For Hatikva, I felt it was a lovely poem, like a song. I don't view it as a national anthem, like by the definition of what anthems should encompass. I just felt it was a very soft, sweet song about the Jewish people, about their strength of character. Their spirit is very strong, their soul is very strong, and they're longing to find their Jewish homeland. It's just a very lovely song and poem. Not so much an anthem, because I don't know how Muslims, people of other faiths in Israel, would stand and honor Hatikva. I just felt it's for and about the Jewish people.
Okay, thank you both very much for your comments and your insights, and especially for sharing them with everyone. And we won't continue the discussion on that right now, but I think discussion is valid on any of these, what you might consider holy grail, things that we don't tend to want to touch. We think it's taboo to even talk about a flag or a national anthem as something that should be considered, should be discussed, whether it is, or at least it has elements that might be considered inappropriate or obsolete. Can we open a discussion about changing those things? I don't know, but I think willingness to talk about it is certainly something that's valid. And whether anything is done, things have been changed over time. There's the gender issue in our Canadian national, that was, instead of saying in all thy sons command, in all that command, so they eliminated that gender issue. So there is a growing sensitivity about the need perhaps to adapt and to change certain things that today are socially problematic, ethnically problematic. But again, it's just a matter of being willing to discuss these things that enhances our awareness and acknowledges that there might be issues with it. Stephen.
Yeah, it's interesting, Michael, because going through chat, I remember back, it was either an associated chat, around the grade 8, 9, 10 era, that we learned the French version of O Canada.
I remember that.
Learned the translation, and this is associated with the, with carrying the cross and the Catholic implications and all that. And they were open-minded enough to teach us the French words, despite the very limited kind of society that it was directed to. And I just wondered among the maybe people attending here, if any of them were originally from Montreal. I don't know if any of you were originally from Montreal, but how it was growing up there with that national anthem, how it was for the Quebecois, who were very nationalistic, in the René Lévesque era, how they actually reacted to that, number one, as Jewish growing up there, number two, among people who are very fervently nationalistic, talking about a Canadian anthem, despite the Catholic bent, but just the fact that they would be singing that, and whether that was something a bit contradictory for their own beliefs. So I just wondered if anybody has that experience.
No, I was brought up in Montreal, but we were literally in a Jewish area. So in fact, even we went to a Protestant school board, but the irony was most of the kids in the school were Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
The anthem was only in English. I don't remember the anthem being for us in French at all.
Yeah. So thank you. Although, Stephen, I remember in French class singing and learning the French words. We didn't really, to be honest, I'd like to believe that there was an openness to accepting it. I think it was just maybe a duty to this, to the French language more than anything else. I don't recall ever studying the words and their meaning. When I look at it today, as Ruth suggested, there are things that are problematic. I won't say troubling, but problematic about our current sensitivities. It reflects a time when those words and that message was certainly appropriate and acceptable and loved. But today we have to look at things a little bit differently. And as we've discussed briefly with monuments and street names, I don't think changing the national anthem completely or even omitting those parts is the appropriate way, because we need to see not just a result and a change, we need to see how things have changed. We need to be able to observe and appreciate a process that's taken place. So you can't just remove things because there's no opportunity to learn where we've been before and how we got to this point we are today. You have to allow future generations to see what the process has been, why we decided that this street name is inappropriate, why we decided that these words in an anthem are somewhat problematic, whether it be in Israel or in Canada, and why this monument is something that's painful to many people. Stephen.
Yeah, no, it was interesting last night at the, at the Black Lives Matter session, how they brought up the statue of Ryerson.
Right.
And the implications. The statue's still standing. I didn't see it toppled, so I don't know when the picture was taken. But it brought up a lot of wounds and a lot of hurt. And this is for the Indigenous community, not so much for the Black community. But just that these monuments are part of the focus of all of these talks, and there's a lot of hurt feelings and long wounds, existing wounds in societies that have had that. So I thought it was very telling that was one statue that was shown yesterday.
Yeah, but I'm very encouraged that there's a willingness to talk about these things. I think I shared with you last time. I don't recall, but I went for a walk with my daughter. We were walking in Queen's Park, and while we were there, there were guys spray painting the statue of McDonald. of Johnny McDonald. It was fascinating. We were there and we were watching the defacement of it take place. They looked at us as we came up and they were wondering if we were going to inform or anything like that. But no, they kept on. They painted him all pink. Statue is more or less covered. And I went there a couple of days ago. It's now completely surrounded by boards. And I guess there's somebody from the city who's working on restoring or removing the paint from there. But here in Toronto, I'm glad to see that there are people who are getting up and making statements about things that are problematic. We need more discussion about that. Sorry, Ruth, you wanted to add one more comment? Go ahead, just unmute yourself.
No, I was just going to say, if you read a bit of or all of that Truth and Reconciliation report, you will see you'll understand why there's so much disgust in leaders, in these former leaders, in these statues. It's terrible. And it helps you understand why there's all this toppling and defacement. I'm not saying that's right. I know we have to understand the history, but if you read some of that, it's disgusting. And
it is, and it brings up another question, and I don't know if we're going to explore that today, but maybe we'll touch on it with what we continue. When you consider a figure like Johnny McDonald or Ryerson with certain problematic elements of their actions, their behavior, their beliefs, does it mean that we are able to disregard everything else they've done that would perhaps was for the benefit of the country, if we can see it as such? Are we willing to listen to operas by Richard Wagner, despite his anti-Semitic leanings? Can we appreciate that music? So there's a variety of opinions on these things. Whether we wipe somebody out because something they did or said or believed doesn't meet our standards or our values, or do we need to see people as being more complicated? I heard a fascinating podcast on the CBC. I don't recall who it was, but they were talking about the fact that all of us have these problematic behaviors and beliefs, and we don't always, sometimes we express them, sometimes we don't, but people are very complicated. You can't say that somebody, everything they do is okay, is approved. Everybody does things that you're not going to like. The question is, where is a line crossed where you disregard that person as a person, or you can separate certain things and beliefs and behaviors, appreciate certain aspects of that person's personality and behavior, and not accept others, but don't disregard the person in his or her entirety. That's a very complicated philosophical question, and we have to have discussions about those things. You can't wipe somebody out completely because they believe something that you don't believe, and you can't say you don't accept everything. They may have done many good things, and just because they did one thing that was unacceptable to you. I'm not talking about abhorrent and brutality and violence that is totally unacceptable, but I'm talking about beliefs at the time that were part of convention and part of social accepted beliefs. Can we eliminate that person as someone of value because he followed what was going on socially or politically at the time? And it's not an easy thing to answer. John, you wanted to add something?
Yes, when I heard basically, Black Lives Mattered, I'm asking the question, in 1936, why didn't Jewish lives matter? Jewish lives matter. I mean, wouldn't it have been a history changer when people spoke up, because at the time, Jewish lives didn't matter. It was okay to speak ill of Jews, to make fun of Jews, to have caricatures which are stereotypes which really didn't reflect who we are or who we were. But at the time, it was a popular social thing to be part of the in crowd, to join in on beating on Jews. That's what came to mind first.
Okay, that's true. But again, you have to be careful to compare different periods of history, because you have to take a look at the accessibility that people have, what's going on, the media access that people have and that they're able to follow. And despite all that, there were plenty of incidents where Black lives didn't matter until recently. There are lots of things going on. You don't have to say it was as bad, or you may say it was worse than what was going on to Jews in Germany in the 1930s. But things have been going on, and we as a society have allowed that to continue. Sure, people have spoken out against it, but what has been done in any significant manner? Civil rights acts in the United States and other places notwithstanding, the fact that there's that sentiment today, it's taken till now for some mass world movement to get things moving in some significant direction. Anyway, it's very difficult to compare historical periods. It doesn't mean we can't discuss them and look at the differences between them, but we have to be aware of that. So Marion, one last comment, and then I want to kind of move on to...
No, I just wanted to say that the statues were put up for a reason. They weren't put up for what they did wrong. It's what they did right. So I think we have to look at what they did right at the time, that they were significant and important. I mean, they wouldn't have been put up otherwise. So I think you have to learn from history the good that they did, and you can't negate the bad, but I think you still have to look at it from the good. They were put up for a reason, and I think that's the lesson you have to teach your children or people, that this person did good things, but they also did bad, and people are human, and that's what happened.
Okay, so that is a great segue into, I want to talk about, at least briefly, about the Parsha before we go on. I want to watch another video with you, and I'll come to that in a moment. But as I mentioned this morning at the Minyan, in a very brief comment on today's portion, Eikev has some rather troubling elements to it. And I shared this sentiment with the people in the Minyan this morning, because it talks about the fact that when the Israelites enter the promised land, they're to destroy the people who live there. They're to eliminate those people who live there because the land has been assigned to them by God. It's promised to them by God. The idolatry and the acts of the people who live there are despicable. Those people are evil. And it says specifically in chapter 9 of Deuteronomy, of Dvarim, it says, and it talks about the fact that it's not on our merit that we inherit the land. It says, Lo b'tzidkatcha u'v'yosher levavcha ata ba lareshet et artzam, ki b'rishat hagoyim ha'ele Adonai Elohecha morisham mipanecha, u'leman hakim et hadavar asher nishbar Adonai lavotecha l'Avraham l'Yitzchak Yaakov. So it is not because of your virtue and your rectitude that you will be able to possess their country, of those nations, but it is because of their wickedness that the Lord your God is dispossessing those nations before you. So we talk about generalizations. Do any of us honestly and sincerely believe, when we read those passages in the Bible, that all of those nations, all the individuals, were evil and wicked, that they all deserve destruction and dispossession of their land? I would say, without a doubt, no. You can't. The moment you put a label on a nation as being wicked and evil, you're doing nothing less than what has been done to Jews for centuries, and what has been done to other ethnic groups living as minorities in societies, or even as majorities, like the blacks were in the south of the United States. You put a label on a people, and you decide that they are less than you, they're inferior, they're wicked, they deserve a collective fate of whatever you decide is appropriate for them. And this is what the Torah is saying in this parsha. And I find that very problematic, because the moment we attribute some kind of collective identity, especially a negative one, to a people, it's very easy from that point to move on to actions that we wouldn't normally accept, but we're willing to do because we think we're doing it for the greater good. And when Jews are considered a pestilence, vermin, an inferior race, or when blacks are considered inferior intellectually, or those who are prone to violence, those kind of labels are not helpful for us in trying to understand and deal with people who are different than us. And yes, you can say that this reflects a reality in ancient times, especially in light of the efforts of those who put this text together to eliminate idolatry. And that's really what's behind all this. These people worship idols. That is something that's antithetical, anathema to Jewish belief in a one God, and not to express that belief through worship of an idol, through something physical, through something tangible. And in order to eliminate that, you're not going to go there and convince them to keep to themselves, not to try to influence the Jews or the Israelites more correctly, or to try to convince them that your way of life is better. That's not the way things worked in ancient times. You didn't have a debate and a discussion on whose religious beliefs are more beneficial for a human existence. If you didn't agree with them and you saw them as a threat and you had the strength, you would wipe them out. You would rationalize your decisions by saying these people are therefore, if they're idol worshipers, they're antithetical to our existence and they need to be eliminated or at least dispossessed and kicked out of the country. I would love to say that that's something that takes place only in historical circumstances, but it's not. And when we complain and acknowledge the fact that there's anti-Semitism today in different places, even in our own beloved, tolerant, inclusive Canada, we have to be able to take a look at how we behave. And I think the lecture last night talking about how racism within the Jewish community, for those who don't seem to fit that Ashkenazi white mold, is something that we haven't really acknowledged or dealt with or coped with in as an appropriate manner as we should have been doing for decades, if not for longer than that. And of course, when we express that racist tendency against those who are not Jewish at all, it's at least as bad, if not worse. And that exists today. And I was particularly struck by that when we were up in the sanctuary. I mentioned this at the Minyan, and I shared news that perhaps some of you are aware of, but there was and it's not the first incident, but there was a mosque in Elmira, just near the Palestinian town of Ramallah, north of Jerusalem, a mosque that was defaced by, apparently, I don't think it's been proven without a doubt, but it's pretty clear that it was Jewish settlers, extremists who live nearby, and came into the town at night and defaced the mosque and burned part of the mosque. So when we hear of our own members from our community, from our nation, whatever their political beliefs may be, resorting to this kind of violent action, which is very biblical. And as a matter of fact, the terms they used are somewhat biblical. They wrote on the walls, Matzor la'aravim velo la'yehudim, Eretz Yisrael la'am Yisrael. The siege is for Arabs, not for Jews. The land of Israel belongs to the people of Israel. So it doesn't talk about a state of Israel. It doesn't talk about political. It uses a biblical term, Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, which is how many of the extremist nationalistic settlers express their attachment to the land. I don't want to dwell too long on that. I just want to mention that it's problematic because it expresses an unwillingness to accept others that live among us. I'm not saying their challenge with living in close proximity to Palestinians is not comprehensible or understandable. The history between the Israelis and Palestinians, Jews and Arabs in that area is something that's been going on for more than 150 years and is not something that's going to be resolved very easily. But again, to attack a place of worship is something that we should be specifically sensitive to because we know how outraged we are when a synagogue is attacked by whomever. And when we are guilty of doing something similar, especially as we entered the sanctuary for the first time in 5 months and appreciate our ability to renew our relationship with a place of worship that we've missed for so long, we need to be especially sensitive to the fact that we, and I say we in a collective sense, are committing similar things, even if that group is a very small extremist group that certainly doesn't represent all the settlers and certainly not the state of Israel, but nevertheless, that activity goes on. And this is only one example. So it's connected with the Torah because in this parashah, we discuss about removing people from the land who are not part of the conquering tribes. This is a very tangible biblical expression of what Parshat Eikev talks about. And we have to be very careful about using any justification of injunctions by God via Moses about how we deal with the land 3,000 years ago, as opposed to how we deal with the land and other people who live there in today's world. So what I wanted to do today is, and we'll spend a little bit of time talking about it, something we talked a little bit about on, those of you who were with me last week on Tisha B'Av, when we looked at the Temple Mount through the eyes of an archaeologist who comes from a Christian background and shared some Christian insights into appreciation for the Temple Mount, because the Christians, so to speak, at the time were not Christians. Jesus and his disciples were Jews. They were not Christians, they were Jews. And to understand something about Jesus, it helps to look back at the Jewish reality at the time. And for us to understand something about Judaism at the time, we can learn a lot from Jesus through his actions as described in the New Testament. Sometimes we talk about, and Steve and I recall at Associated and perhaps at Chat back then, maybe today it's a little more open, but talking about Christianity, visiting a church, looking at the New Testament was not something that was ever on the table. It was something that was not part of our education, not part of our exposure. And I think it's a shame. It's one of the things I regret about my day school education. Many things I appreciate, as we talk about appreciating certain things and perhaps looking at other things in a critical way, that would be my view of my day school education here in Toronto. It wasn't as open, as inclusive as I would have liked it to be through my eyes today, of course. My eyes as a teenager were very different, as was that of the community at the time. But I think part of understanding a little bit of where we've come from is exploring some of the concepts about Judaism that we often don't question or don't even aren't fully aware of in terms of their significance. And so, with that introduction, I wanted to offer you a 30-minute lecture. And again, those of you who have to leave early, whatever, we'll take a few minutes at the end to discuss it. But there's a course offered by Jody Magnus, whom we heard from on Tisha B'Av about the Temple Mount. She teaches a course called Jesus and His Jewish Influences. So it's I believe it's a 24 lecture course. Don't worry, we're not going to watch the whole thing. But what I wanted to do is today to watch that first lecture, which is entitled Jesus the Jew. And the last class we have in 2 weeks in the evening is going to be the very last lecture. And that's entitled, I don't have a light here, Jesus Teachings and Sayings in Context. Meaning, where did Jesus come up with his ideas? Where does much of the writings in the New Testament, at least the Gospels, the four Gospels, the first four books of the New Testament, where do the influences for those teachings come from? We talk about Christian teaching, we talk about Jewish teaching, and often we don't see the incredible similarity and influences that one had on the other. Certainly, much of the teachings in the Gospels comes from Jewish sources, whether they be the Bible or oral rabbinic teachings at the time, and that's something we'll explore briefly in the last session. But today, we're just going to take a look at this first lecture called Jesus the Jew and try to understand a little bit about the world in which Jesus lived and some of the concepts or beliefs that were part of that world, some of which we take for granted today. So without further ado, here's Jody Magnus. Give me a second to share the screen with you. Just give me a thumbs up if you can hear to make sure I've got the volume on.
This is a course about Jesus and his Jewish influences. What does that mean? What are the goals of this course? My goals are to better understand Jesus's life and teachings within the context of early Judaism, by which I mean Judaism in the time of Jesus, drawing on selected passages from the New Testament. The value of this lies in as follows. Understanding Jesus as a Jew sheds light on what the teachings and sayings attributed to Jesus meant to him and his first followers. Furthermore, the New Testament accounts provide valuable information about Judaism in the time of Jesus. In other words, I think that the value of this course is in better understanding Jesus in his context but also taking the New Testament, and especially the gospel accounts, and using them to better understand Judaism in the time of Jesus. Now, I'm going to be making a number of assumptions that underlie this course that I'd like to lay out right from the start. First of all, I assume that there was a historical Jesus. That is, that there was an actual man named Jesus. And I assume that this man named Jesus was a Jew from Galilee who lived in the early 1st century AD or CE. I also assume that although they were written a couple of generations after Jesus' death, the canonical Gospels, and especially the Synoptics, preserve some authentic traditions about Jesus' life and teachings. But let me make clear, I am not a New Testament scholar, and I am not concerned with authenticating the gospel accounts of Jesus' sayings and activities. Instead, I am interested in how the gospel accounts are better understood within the context of early Judaism, that is, Judaism in the time of Jesus, and how they help inform us about Jesus' life and ministry within that context. Now, in order to talk about Jesus and his Jewish influences, we have to define a few basic terms. And one of the most basic terms is, who is a Jew? Even today, the question of who is a Jew is fraught with lots of controversy and questions. And it was no less fraught in antiquity. But of course, for this course, we're going to be focusing on antiquity. So today, the terms Jew and Jewish refer to people of a certain religion. But originally, the terms Jew and Jewish referred to someone of Judean origin. And when I say Judean origin, I mean that is someone whose family came from the district of Judah. What exactly is the district of Judah? We're going to be talking about that more in the coming lectures, but basically the district of Judah refers to the geographical area centering on the city of Jerusalem. So people who came from that geographical region, Jerusalem and the surrounding area, were either Judahites or Judeans, and that's where the word Jew comes from originally. So originally a Jew is someone from that geographical region. So how do we get from there to Jews being a certain religion? In antiquity, every city or kingdom had its own special patron deity, even if the people of that city or kingdom worshipped many different gods. So usually what happened in antiquity was you would have people worshiping many different gods, but they would have one particular special patron deity. Perhaps one of the more famous examples is Athena, who was, of course, the patron goddess of Athens. The people of Athens worshipped many different gods, but Athena was their special patron deity, and of course, the city of Athens was named after her. So similarly, the God of Israel was the patron deity of the Israelite tribes, the 12 tribes of Israel. And later, the God of Israel was the patron deity of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. So a Jew, by definition then, in antiquity, was someone of Judean descent, someone from the geographical region of Judah or Judea. And by definition, Jews or Judeans worship the God of Israel as their patron deity, hence this sort of combination of geography and religion. Now, in antiquity, Jews were in fact called Judeans. The Greek term is Judaioi, and that term Judaioi actually means both Jews and Judeans. It doesn't make a distinction between the religion and the geographical location. It encompasses both of those meanings. So ancient Jews or Judeans, Greek Judaioi, were basically the descendants of the inhabitants of Judah, the people of Judah. who worshiped the God of Israel as their patron deity, as their national deity or national God, and by definition, lived according to his laws, lived according to the laws that the God of Israel had given his people. And those are the laws that are contained in what Jews call the Torah, or the 5 books of Moses, or the Pentateuch. The Greeks and Romans characterized the laws in the Torah, in the 5 books of Moses, as the ancestral laws of the Jews. So they viewed them as ancient laws that were given to the Jews by their national deity. Now, there has been some recent controversy about the term Judeoi, this Greek term that can be translated as meaning either Jews or Judeans. Recently, some scholars have begun to translate Judeoi from the Greek as Judeans rather than as Jews. And the reason for the controversy is that other scholars claim that translating Judeoi as Judeans eliminates the religious aspect of ancient Judaism by emphasizing the geographical origin and eliminates Jews from the historical record. In other words, it obliterates the religious aspect of Judaism, focusing instead or emphasizing instead the geographical origin. This problem of the translation of Judeoi is particularly acute in relation to the Gospel of John, because the Gospel of John uses the term Judeos or Judeoi, Jews, Judeans, approximately 70 times, far more than the other 3 Gospels combined. In John, the Judeoi figure most prominently as the opponents of Jesus, whose lying and murderous conspiracy to have him crucified demonstrates that they are children of the devil. That's John 8:44. A scholar named Adele Reinhartz points out that, quote, the potent association between the Judeoi and the devil remains deeply embedded in anti-Semitic discourse to this day. Eliminating the Jews lets the Gospel of John off the hook for its role in the history of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, end of quote. So you can understand, I hope, the reasons behind the controversy in translating Judeoi as Jews or Judeans, and I think that the preferable understanding lies somewhere in the middle. That is, it's a term that encompasses both the religion and the geographical origin of these people, which in antiquity was all part of the same picture. Now, all of this leads to another fundamental definition, and that is, what is a temple? We're going to be talking a lot about temple in this course, especially the Second Temple. And so I think it's necessary for us to start out by understanding what we mean by that term. In antiquity, and actually also in many countries still today, a temple was literally the house of the deity. That is literally the house in which the god or the goddess dwells. Now, today, by the way, there is a custom among many Jews of calling a synagogue a temple, but in fact, a temple is something that's quite different. In antiquity, usually only priests entered the temple in order to service the needs of the deity, to bathe the deity, feed the deity, and clothe the deity. Everyone else stayed outside the temple building and congregated around an altar where priests offered sacrifices to the deity. Now, in contrast, a synagogue is not a temple. A synagogue is analogous to a church or a mosque. It is a congregational building for prayer and worship. So, in fact, in many ways, synagogues churches and mosques are the opposite of what a temple was in antiquity. Ordinary people did not go into a temple building in antiquity. They certainly did not go into a temple to pray and worship. They stayed outside the building, whereas, of course, synagogues, churches, and mosques today are intended to accommodate congregations of people for the purposes of prayer and worship. So they're very, very different things, and let us not confuse them. Now, we are going to be focusing in this course on the temple to the God of Israel. This temple was located on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And in fact, there were 2 successive temples dedicated to the God of Israel on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. The first temple, which is Solomon's temple, built by Solomon, was constructed somewhere around 960 BC and destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BC. And we call that period the First Temple period. The Second Temple was consecrated in 516 BC, was rebuilt around 20 to 10 BC by King Herod the Great, and was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. And so we call that period the Second Temple period. Before I go on, let me make one more clarification about terminology that I'm going to be using in this course. I am going to use the terms BC and AD instead of BCE and CE. BC, of course, means before Christ, and AD means Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord. BCE means before the Common Era or before the Christian era, and CE means the Common Era or Christian era. BCE and CE are often preferred because they are more neutral terms religiously than BC and AD. I'm choosing to use BC and AD because they will be more familiar terms to the majority of people who watch this course. So I'm not trying to make a religious statement. It's just a choice to make people, hopefully most people, a little more comfortable with what I'm going to be talking about. I also would like to clarify what I'm going to be talking about in terms of the chronological parameters of this course, and that is that I'm going to begin with the Israelite Exodus, the story of the Israelite Exodus from Egypt and the settlement of the 12 tribes of Israel in Canaan. And then I'm going to focus mostly on the Second Temple period, and especially the late Second Temple period, that is the 1st century BC and 1st century AD, so the time of Jesus, in other words. So what I'd like to do now is talk a little bit about how ancient Judaism was similar to and different from other ancient religions. And personally, as a scholar of early Judaism and archaeology, I find that often our view of ancient Judaism is distorted because we tend to remove it from its context and consider it to be different, something other than other ancient religions, when in fact ancient Judaism was actually very similar to other ancient religions. So I think that to understand ancient Judaism, you have to understand it within the broader context of ancient religions in the Mediterranean world and the Near East. And so, for example, ancient Judaism was similar to other ancient religions in having a temple that housed the deity. That is, in having a house that housed the deity that was being worshipped. In the case of the temple in Jerusalem, the needs of the God of Israel were serviced by priests who offered sacrifices on an altar located outside the temple building, and that too is like other ancient religions. So in other words, conceptually, ancient Judaism operated like other religions in the Mediterranean world and the Near East, but with a few differences. So what are some of these differences? Well, eventually, Judaism mandated that there should be only one temple to the God of Israel on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, whereas other ancient religions typically had more than one temple building, or could have more than one temple building dedicated to the same god or goddess. You can think again about Athena. There are temples to Athena that were located all around the ancient world and not just in one place in Athens. So the fact that Judaism eventually mandated that there could be only one temple building to the God of Israel, and it had to be on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, this was something that was different from other ancient religions. Even though, and now I'm going to qualify this sort of principle that there should be only one temple to the God of Israel on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, this principle was actually not universally observed. There were, in fact, other ancient temples dedicated to the God of Israel outside of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. So even that principle, which we think was universally observed, was in fact not universally observed. Another difference between Judaism and other ancient religions is that Judaism prohibited the worship of other gods alongside the God of Israel. We are actually going to see that that principle also was not originally true of the worship of the God of Israel, and it was also not originally universally observed. So we will be talking about that. That eventually comes to be the case, but it was not originally the case. Another difference between Judaism and other ancient religions is that Judaism prohibited representing the God of Israel in physical form, which means if you walked into other ancient temples, of course, inside the most interior part of the temple, you would have a cult statue representing the deity, and Judaism came to prohibit the physical representation of the God of Israel with a cult statue or any other kind of physical representation. Another difference between ancient Judaism and other ancient religions is that the priesthood in Judaism is a caste system, by which I mean that to be a priest in Judaism, you had to be born into a priestly family. And in most other ancient religions, not all other ancient religions, but in most other ancient religions, the priesthood was an office that could be bought and sold. So if you were wealthy, for example, and you wanted to serve as a priest, you could pay a certain amount of money and you could serve as a priest. That was not the case in Judaism. You have priestly families, and even until today, Judaism preserves that principle. Yet another difference between Judaism and other ancient religions is that Jews possessed a corpus of written laws, sacred scripture, given to them by the God of Israel, instructing them on how to worship God and live their lives. So having this written down sacred scripture is something that distinguished the Jews from other ancient peoples. Now, I'd like to define another couple of terms here, because this is something that people don't really understand, and that is we often refer to Judaism as a monotheistic religion, right? We refer to Judaism, Christianity, Islam as monotheistic religions. What exactly is monotheism? Monotheism literally it means in Greek, the belief in only one deity, that you believe in only one deity. So by that meaning that only one deity exists, the existence of only one deity. And I contrast this with another term that I find more useful, that not everybody agrees with me that this is a useful term, but I think it is, and that is the term monolatry. Monolatry, literally translated, is the worship of only one God while not denying the existence of other deities. In other words, monolatry says that there are many different gods out there acknowledging their existence, but somebody who is monolatrous then would worship only one God among that pantheon of gods. I think that monolatry is a more appropriate description of ancient Judaism than monotheism. I think that, this is my personal opinion, that ancient Jews took for granted that there were many different deities that existed, but Judaism mandated that Jews could worship only the God of Israel, who of course was their chief deity. And I think that if you look at selected passages from both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, that you will find support for this position. And so, for example, let's take Psalm 86:8, which says, "There is none like you among the gods, O Lord." There is none like you among the gods, O Lord. So in other words, there are a lot of gods, but there's none like the God of Israel. So again, a reflection of this notion that there are many gods out there, but the God of Israel is the special one, the chief deity. There's a Greek term that relates to this sort of discussion of, this chief deity among many other deities, and that is the term theos hypsistos. Theos hypsistos. In Greek, theos hypsistos literally means the highest God or the God most high. Ancient peoples like the Greeks would apply this term, theos hypsistos, to the chief deity in a pantheon. So, for example, in the Greek pantheon, Zeus was the chief deity, or in the Roman pantheon, Jupiter was the chief deity. And so often this term, this epithet, would be applied to the chief deity, and he would be called the God Most High, Theos Hypsistos. Interestingly, we sometimes find this term, Theos Hypsistos, also applied to the God of Israel. Because from the ancient point of view, if you were not an Israelite or a Jew, right, and you're looking at the Jews, then the God who they worshipped, the God of Israel, would have been analogous to a chief deity, a Theos Hypsistos. And so sometimes this Greek term, Theos Hypsistos, is used by actually non-Jews and Jews alike in antiquity to denote the God of Israel. And it seems to be an equivalent of a Hebrew term, El Elyon, which literally translated means the God Most High. We can actually see these terms used in a couple of interesting biblical passages. So first of all, Genesis 14, verses 18 to 19 say, "And King Melchizedek of Salem brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. He blessed him and said, 'Blessed be Abraham by God Most High, maker of heaven and earth.'" So in this passage referring to Melchizedek, you see the use of this term, God Most High, El Elyon, which became in the Greek and Roman world sort of the term Theos Hypsistos, the same idea of this God Most High, this chief deity who is the supreme deity above all others. Similarly, in Daniel 2, verse 47, we read, "The king said to Daniel, 'Truly, your God is God of gods and Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries.'" So notice, your God is God of gods. So again, this idea that the God of Israel is a chief deity among a pantheon of deities, not saying that the Jews worship the other deities, but that conceptually what you have is a pantheon with this God, the God of Israel, being conceived of as a chief deity. And similarly, Daniel 3, verse 26 says, "Nebuchadnezzar then approached the door of the furnace of blazing fire and said, 'Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out.'" So again, you see the use of this term, Most High God, to refer to the God of Israel. Now, those passages that we just looked at, of course, come from the Hebrew Bible. But this concept of the God of Israel being a chief deity in a pantheon or a world where there are many other gods is also reflected in the New Testament. And so, for example, in Mark 5, verse 7, which is a passage that deals with the healing of the Gerasene demoniac, we read, "And he shouted at the top of his voice, 'What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?'" So notice that Jesus here is described as the son of which God? The Most High God, who of course is the God of Israel. And similarly, in Luke 1, verses 32 and 35, and also, by the way, elsewhere in Luke, we see the same concept reflected. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. The Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. Who's the Most High? Of course, again, it's the Most High God, the God of Israel, who, of course, is above all other gods. So to understand ancient Judaism, it is important to remember that the Jews were embedded in a world that was populated by not just lots of different peoples, but peoples who worshiped many different gods. And the Jewish God was conceived of as the chief deity, the highest God of the people of Israel.
So, some interesting material there to ponder. I just want to make a few comments, and I know it's a little bit late, but if any of you have any questions or things you'd like to share, you'll be welcome. Just a couple of terms. So, Professor Magnus talked about near the beginning when she's discussing who is a Jew. She mentioned today that when we talk about Jews or Judaism or Jewish, you're talking about mostly religion. And of course, that's something that would be challenged by many Jews today. In fact, they would say that Judaism is not so much a religion, or we talk about the Jewish people, we talk about nationhood, we talk about a culture, we talk about a whole variety of definitions and expressions of Judaism. Many Jews would not agree that Judaism is only a religion today. So there'd be a difference of opinion about how we define that today. But of course, her focus is on antiquity, and that's with what I would remain. The other thing is that Professor Magnus mentions this idea about patron deity living in a temple. And you might say, well, God doesn't live in a temple. Of course not. That's not Jewish belief. We see God as being everywhere. God is omnipresent. And yet, in the Bible, there are many expressions, both with regards to the Mishkan, which the Jews the Israelites, carried around for 40 years, as well as in the temple. The purpose of those edifices were, so God, hashochen betocham, so v'shachanti betocham. The purpose of erecting those was that God could dwell among us, whether physically or virtually or metaphorically. Those are the terms used, to dwell among us within those buildings that were constructed for that purpose. So this idea of our patron deity, if I can use her terms, living among us in the temple, that's something that is verbally within our own texts. And the last thing I'll comment on before giving an opportunity for those who may have questions or comments is I find her definition of the monolatry, this idea of worshiping one and choosing one to be the Most High, El Elyon. I would give you an assignment. Go through our liturgy. Go through the Siddur. How many times in the Amidah, which we say 3 times a day? El Elyon. It talks about God, the Most High of all gods. Ha'el Hagadol Hagibor Vanora El Elyon. We say that 3 times a day. Now, you may say, and there are probably many Jewish scholars who may define El Elyon in other terms, but if you think about it, El Elyon, the God Most High, the God above all others, there's some veracity to what Professor Magnus has to say about this idea of God being considered the God among others. And I chose this today in relation to the parashah because whether or not, and I don't know what your theological inclinations are, but whether or not you believe there's a God at all, or you believe there are other gods, this idea that we worship a God because we see that God as the God most worthy and meritorious of our worship, of our admiration. If there are other gods, I don't know, but there are indications, as Professor Magnus says, that other gods were around, and Israelites, if you look carefully, there are many indications, many references in the Bible during the First Temple period especially, but as we can see in the Second Temple period as well, that Israelites worshipped other gods. The complaint of many of the prophets, in addition to their ethical behavior about how they treated their fellow human beings, there's plenty of mention of idolatry, of worshiping other gods, what you might call, and we often refer to as covering your bases. Just in case that other god has some influence, I want to make sure I sacrifice something to him or put a little statue in a corner of my house, even if, of course, Adonai, the God El Elyon, that's the ultimate God, that's my patron deity. But I want to make sure if this other God can help me in some way, maybe I'll offer him some sacrifice. And the most perhaps horrific example of that is Menashe, one of the kings of Judah, who reigned, I think, the longest, if not the second longest of all kings of Judah, also considered one of the most idolatrous of those. He put up, and it says in the book of Kings, he says he put up a statue of Asherah as the consort of the Israelite God, of the patron deity of God, in the temple. He put up an idol of Asherah. What could be more horrific to a monotheistic belief, or even a monolatrous belief? So this idea that other deities were worshipped by Israelites at the same time as they worshiped the God of gods, there are plenty of indications, textual indications, and even archaeological indications of that. And so when we try to understand a little bit about where we've come from in terms of our beliefs, in terms of our worship, there's a lot more we have in common with ancient religions than we would like to believe. And part of that, through other lectures in this course, which we're not going to be covering, show us that there's a lot more that we have in common with Christianity than we're willing to believe, because Christianity stems from Judaism. It's the influences on Jesus and his early followers are from the biblical texts and from the rabbinic teachings of the time, and that's something we'll explore a little more in our final class, if you're with me or if you watch it recorded. The one will take place in the evening of August 20th. So it's a lot of material to think about today, but the purpose and my goal for bringing this out is for us to constantly be willing to acknowledge the existence of other options out there for other people in terms of their religious beliefs. And by saying that we choose something does not disregard or does not deny the existence of other beliefs. I'm even talking about gods. And so part of our ability to appreciate what we have is to understand that in comparison with other people have. But in order to do that, you have to acknowledge that other people have valid beliefs in their eyes. And whether it's a religious belief, whether it's political beliefs, we have to be willing to listen and learn about others in order to fully appreciate our own, and in order to come to some kind of understanding that the world is a varied and diverse place, and we shouldn't see it, or we shouldn't see ourselves having the exclusive and single truth about that understanding. So if there are any questions or brief comments, I'm certainly willing to entertain that. John, you had your hand up first, and then Lynn.
Yes, a little bit of a biblical reference. At the incident of the golden calf, God says to Moses, I'm not talking anymore. You can deal through one of my angels like the other nations. So there is intermediary, you call it, deities between a nation and God. The other one is the name of the most high angel, Michael. So there is a concept in some forms of Judaism where God is a chief executive deity, so to speak, and he runs a bureaucracy, a corporation of angels of different levels to get his work done through the universe, through all peoples and so on. And so the idea that God works alone is not so popular as God is a chief executive deity, which says something and his army or bureaucracy of angels go and carry it out on his behalf. So my 2 cents.
Okay, thank you. Lynn, you wanted to share something.
Yeah, I'm struggling a little bit with this because if God in those times or at any times was the chief God amongst a bunch of others, we talk about Greek myths and Roman myths. What does that do to the concept of God?
Because that's the way we understand those. If you'd spoken to ancient Greeks, of course, many of them, although perhaps some of the more rational ones, some of the philosophers may have viewed the deities otherwise, but even Greek philosophy appreciated and accepted the existence of a pantheon of gods for the most part. Today, we look at them as myths because we traditionally don't like to believe that there are, they were simply a way for ancient peoples to understand how the world worked. But what is an understanding of a single God other than an understanding of how the world worked? How is that any different than a Greek understanding of a often violent and irrational behavior of a Jupiter or a Zeus? Why should that be considered any different than what we often describe as the behavior of an angry and irrational God who wants to destroy the people he brought out of Egypt? So it all depends on your initial perspective, where you come from. I imagine many people today look at the tales in the Torah and consider them no less mythological than the way we consider the array of Greek stories and narratives from their own tradition and culture. Stephen, go ahead.
Hi, yeah, it's interesting. One thing that she didn't mention and that you haven't discussed is the fact that in the Tanakh, there's actually descriptions of the Israelites with what were called teraphim. And there's another word, I forgot, Mike, you would know. There's the something and teraphim, which were figurines. And in almost every archaeological site, well, not all, but in many archaeological sites that were unearthing the original settlements of the Israelites, whether it's Judah or northern Israel, they found buried with these people, they actually buried some of these little figurines, and they're actually listed in the Tanakh. I forget the other word, you probably would know, but they were actual figurines that represented deities, and they were kept in the homes as good luck charms, or as, like you say, you wanted to make sure you covered all your bases. And they had these figurines that were effigies of deities, which were supposed to be disallowed. And they were actually used, and they were really prevalent in a lot of places throughout ancient Israel. And the other thing she mentioned, which was also alluded to in her talk on Tisha B'Av, was that there were temples that mimicked the Beit HaMikdash, places where people could worship without having to go all the way to Jerusalem. I mean, it was a tedious trip, and they were supposed to go on the Shalosh Regalim, but in between, are you supposed to have like 45 weeks of just no contact with the actual original temple? And these temples were built, and they've been found in various parts of Israel, some that were surprisingly close to Jerusalem, as you know. So there were these other areas of worship. You can call them temples, you can call them, Batei Knesset, whatever, that were there in the same design, and these other teraphim that they had. So there was a lot of other recognition of other potential, deities and effigies in that time.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, definitely. I forget the other word as well at the time, but yeah, there were these physical expressions of some kind of worship, even if not on the same level as the God of gods, but still the fact that they had these in their homes and other places, there's plenty of evidence to that. And of course, we have the Israelite competing temples in the north, Dan, and you have as well, we looked at this a couple of years ago, the temple built in Elephantine in Egypt on the Nile, a replica of a temple, interestingly, as we mentioned then, that existed beside Egyptian temple. So there was a coexistence at the time and an acknowledgement of two very different types of worship, but living side by side, interestingly. So I'll take one last, Avi, I think you had one comment. I'll make that the last one and I'll let you guys go. Go ahead, Avi, just unmute yourself.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I agree with, I just agree with the thing that people said that Jesus is just also a mythical type of figurine of speech or something.
Okay, thank you very much, Avi. So thank you all.
No problem.
As some of you expressed, Lynn in particular, some of this stuff is a little bit challenging to think of, but that's part of exploring things in an honest way. We have certain assumptions about our traditional religious beliefs, the way we process and conceptualize that belief. And we have certain views of our anthems, about certain symbols in our national culture as well. And if we want to be honest and progress and grow, we have to be willing to explore the meanings of those, not just at a certain point in time, but as we go through our own lives and see if they have the same relevance and significance. So hopefully this has given you a little bit of material to think about. As I said, our last class won't be in the morning, unfortunately, but it will take place on the 20th, on August the 20th in the evening. And then we'll listen to a little more specific reference to both rabbinic and gospel teaching, and to see how similar both the terminology and the messages in those two, which hopefully gives some indication that it's worth exploring what we have in common with others as much as those differences that separate us. So have a wonderful day, everybody. Thank you again for joining us. And we'll look forward to seeing you on the 20th and certainly on future occasions here in Shul.
Michael, make sure that they record